The wind off the harbor carried salt and rust that morning, the kind of smell that clung to my jacket no matter how many times I washed it. I liked it, though. It meant work. It meant another paycheck, another step further from the silence that used to swallow me whole. My name is Klinton. I'm 26, 6'2", and an omega, a fact that, depending on who you ask, either makes me fragile or makes me a curiosity. I've spent the last 4 years proving it's neither. Klinton, get that beam secured before lunch or we're behind schedule again. Foreman Reyes barked from the scaffolding above me. On it, I called back, hooking my harness and climbing. People stared sometimes. An omega on a construction site wasn't common. Most of my kind were tucked away in offices, or worse, tucked away in houses, waiting for an alpha to come home and tell them they'd done a good job existing. I wasn't built for waiting. Waiting was what I'd done the night my parents died, sitting in a hospital corridor with blood on my hands that wasn't mine, waiting for someone to tell me I still had a family. Nobody ever did. That kind of waiting breaks something in you. So I decided a long time ago I'd rather break my back working than break my spirit, depending on anyone. I was halfway up the beam, tightening the last bolt, when I felt it, that prickling at the back of my neck, the kind that makes every instinct in an omega's body sit up and pay attention. I glanced down. He was standing at the edge of the site, dressed like he'd wandered out of a magazine and gotten lost on his way to somewhere far more glamorous than a construction yard. Tall, dark-haired, jaw cut sharp enough to open envelopes, in a charcoal coat that probably cost more than my yearly rent. He wasn't looking at the building. He was looking at me. "That's Arturo Chester," one of the guys muttered beside me, a thick in his voice. "Chester Holdings. Owns half the skyline you're standing on." I'd heard the name. Everyone had. Alpha Arturo Chester, billionaire, ruthless in boardrooms, colder than a winter morning according to every tabloid that tried and failed to get close to him. Unmated, untouchable, and apparently, right now very much watching me rivet steel 40 feet in the air. I finished my bolt and didn't look at him again. Whatever he wanted, it wasn't my business. Except it became my business 20 minutes later, when Reyes jogged up to me on break, looking like he'd swallowed his own tongue. "Mr. Chester wants to speak with you." "I'm on lunch," I said, unwrapping my sandwich like that settled it. Cross. That's the Arturo Chester. I know who he is. I'm still on lunch. Reyes opened his mouth, closed it, then walked off shaking his head like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. You don't usually tell a billionaire alpha to wait his turn behind a turkey sandwich. But he did wait. I felt him before I saw him. Alphas have a way of making the air feel heavier when they're near, and his was heavier than most, dark and clean like cedar after rain. He crouched near where I sat on a stack of pallets, not towering over me the way most alphas like to, and that, more than anything, made me actually look up. "You're efficient," he said. No greeting, no introduction, like he assumed I already knew exactly who he was and didn't need the formalities. "Reyes says you've redone the safety inspection schedule twice this month, off the clock, because the last one had errors that could have gotten someone hurt." "It needed fixing," I said. Didn't seem right to let people work somewhere unsafe just because nobody else wanted to do the paperwork. Most people wouldn't bother. Most people aren't me. Something flickered behind his dark eyes, amusement maybe, or surprise, I couldn't tell which. Alphas like him weren't used to being answered without a tremor of submission in the voice. I didn't have one to give him. "I have a proposition," he said. "I'm not interested. You don't know what it is yet." "I know what it sounds like," I said, taking a bite of my sandwich just to prove how unbothered I was, even though my pulse had picked up traitorously the second he'd crouched close enough that I could smell him properly. Rich alpha sees an omega working a job beneath his notice, decides to rescue him. Offers him a soft bed, a fat allowance, and a leash with a pretty bow on it. "No thank you, Mr. Chester. I didn't survive what I survived to end up some alpha's pet project." I expected anger. Alphas didn't like being refused. It was practically written into their biology to bristle at it. Instead, he tilted his head, studying me the way you'd study a puzzle that had unexpectedly rearranged itself. "That's not what I was offering," he said quietly. "I was going to offer you a position managing safety compliance across 3 of my sites. Full salary, benefits, your own office. Because you're good at your job, Klinton. Not because of your designation." He crawled up my neck. I hated being wrong almost as much as I hated being underestimated, and somehow he'd managed to hand me both in one sentence. "Oh," I said. "Oh," he echoed, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to make something in my chest do an embarrassing little flip. Though I won't pretend the other thought hadn't crossed my mind. "Excuse me." "You heard me." He stood, brushing non-existent dust from his knees, and looked down at me with an expression that was suddenly, devastatingly direct. "I don't make a habit of noticing people, Klinton. I noticed you 3 weeks ago, the first day you started here. I've been finding excuses to walk past this site ever since. My heart was doing something erratic and stupid. I refused to let it show." "Well, you can stop wasting your excuses," I said, standing too, brushing past him to toss my sandwich wrapper in the bin. "I don't need rescuing, and I'm definitely not interested in being someone's experiment in slumming it with a broke omega." "I never said broke. You didn't have to." He didn't follow me when I walked away, though I felt his eyes on my back the entire length of the yard, warm and unrelenting, like sunlight after a long winter. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things that day. He came back 2 days later, and the day after that, always at the edge of the site, always with some perfectly reasonable excuse, checking on the property, since I do own it, and always managing to find 5 minutes to talk to me, usually about something other than the job offer. He asked what I was reading. He asked if I'd eaten. He asked, once, with a strange rawness in his voice, what had happened to make me so determined never to need anyone. I didn't answer that one. Some doors I wasn't ready to open for a stranger, no matter how good he smelled or how steady his presence felt against the chaos that still lived in my chest some nights. "You're persistent," I told him on the 5th visit, when he showed up with 2 coffees and handed me one without asking if I wanted it, which I did infuriatingly. "I'm an alpha who knows what he wants," he said. "Sue me. And what is it you want, exactly?" He considered the question longer than I expected, his dark eyes serious in a way that didn't match the lazy confidence he usually wore like armor. "I want to know you," he said finally. "Not the version the city will eventually write about, the Omega who clawed his way out of tragedy and refused to bow to anyone. I want the version that exists right now, on a pallet stack, eating a sandwich and telling billionaires to wait their turn." My throat tightened in a way I didn't appreciate. "That version isn't very interesting," I said, voice rougher than I meant it to be. "I disagree." He stepped closer, not crowding, never crowding. He was always careful that way, like he understood instinctively that I needed room to breathe, even when every Omega instinct in me wanted to lean into the warmth radiating off him. "I think that version is the bravest person I've ever met. And I think he's terrified of letting anyone close enough to find out." I should have walked away. Instead, I stood there, coffee burning my palms through the cardboard sleeve, and let him see, just for a second, the crack in the armor. "My parents died when I was 22, I said. "House fire. I was the only one who made it out. For 2 years, I couldn't sleep without the lights on, couldn't be in a room with anyone touching me without panicking. Everyone expected me to fall apart and become exactly what Omegas are supposed to be, soft, dependent, looking for an alpha to hold the pieces together. I refused. I decided I'd rather hold myself together, even badly, than hand the job to someone who'd eventually get tired of doing it." Arturo didn't say anything for a long moment. He didn't reach for me, didn't try to fix it with some grand alpha gesture the way I half expected. He just stood there, steady, letting the words settle between us like something sacred. "I'm not going to get tired," he said eventually, quiet and certain. "And I'm not asking you to hand me the job, Cross. I'm asking if I can stand next to you while you do it yourself." Something in my chest, something that had been clenched tight for 4 years, loosened just a fraction. That's a very pretty line for a man who runs 3 companies and probably has a PR team writing his speeches. I said, because vulnerability terrified me more than fire ever had. He laughed. Actually laughed, low and surprised, like I'd cracked something open in him too. "My PR team would have a heart attack if they knew half the things I've said to you." "Good," I said, finally letting myself smile. "Keep them guessing." He looked at me like I'd handed him something precious. Maybe I had. I wasn't ready to call it that yet. Wasn't ready to call any of it anything. But as he walked back to his car that evening, glancing over his shoulder once like he couldn't quite make himself stop looking, I realized the dread that usually crept in after dark, the dread that lived in my chest like an old scar, had gone quiet for the first time in years. It didn't last. Nothing good ever does, not without a fight first. But that night, lying in my small apartment with the city humming outside my window, I let myself wonder, just once, what it might feel like to stop fighting everyone and start letting one person in. The job offer sat in my email inbox for 6 days before I opened it. I told myself it was because I was busy. Truth was, I kept hearing his voice in my head. I'm asking if I can stand next to you while you do it yourself, and I didn't know what to do with how much I wanted to say yes to a man I'd known for less than 2 weeks. In the end, I didn't take the position. Not because I doubted I could do it, but because I needed him to understand something fundamental before this went any further. I found him outside the site office on a Thursday evening, the sky bruising purple behind the half-finished tower we'd been raising for months. He was leaning against his car, no driver in sight, tie loosened like he'd had a long day of being the terrifying CO everyone whispered about. "I'm not taking the job," I said, before he could even greet me. Something shuddered briefly in his expression, there and gone. "May I ask why?" "Because if I take it, every person on this site will say I slept my way into an office with a window. They'll say the Omega got soft the second a rich alpha looked his way. I've spent 4 years building a reputation brick by brick, and I'm not handing it to anyone, not even you, to tear down in one signature." He was quiet for a moment, and then slowly, something like respect bled into his face. "That's fair. That's it. No argument. Would it work?" "No. Then there's no point wasting both our evenings." He pushed off the car, hands in his pockets, watching me with an intensity that made my skin feel too warm despite the cooling air. "But I'm not going anywhere, Cross. I'll find other reasons to be near you that have nothing to do with my company. You're going to stalk a construction site indefinitely? If that's what it takes." I should have found that alarming. Instead, infuriatingly, I found it charming, which probably said more about the state of my heart than I was ready to admit. 3 months passed that way. He never offered me another job. He showed up with coffee, with terrible jokes that landed better than they should have, with quiet patience every time my trauma reared up. Like the afternoon a backfiring truck sent me straight back to that night, flames and sirens, and the smell of smoke clawing up my throat, and I found myself crouched against a wall, shaking, unable to breathe. He didn't touch me. He'd learned, somehow, without me ever telling him explicitly, that touch during those moments made it worse, not better. Instead, he sat on the ground beside me, close enough that I could feel his warmth without contact, and talked, low, steady, about nothing important, the stock market, a terrible meeting he'd sat through, anything to give my mind a thread to hold on to besides the fire. "You came back," I rasped once the shaking stopped, humiliated and raw. "Why wouldn't I? Most people leave. Once they see this part of me." "Then most people are fools," he said simply, and something about the certainty in his voice made tears prick at my eyes for an entirely different reason than the panic had. By the time I left that company for a better position, safety director at a mid-size firm, no nepotism, no help from him, every bit of it earned through interviews I'd sweated through alone, he'd become something I didn't have a name for yet. Not quite mine. Not quite a stranger anymore either. "You're leaving," he said the day I told him, voice carefully neutral in a way that didn't match the tightness around his eyes. "It's a good opportunity." "I know." He exhaled, raked a hand through his hair, and for the first time since I'd met him, Arturo Chester looked almost unsure of himself. "I just thought, I don't know what I thought, that we had time." "We still do," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "I'm not leaving the city, Arturo. I'm leaving a job site. There's a difference." His eyes snapped to mine, something hopeful and helpless flickering there. "You used my name. I use your name all the time." "Not like that." He stepped closer, and this time I didn't step back. "Not like it means something." The air between us went taut, charged in a way that had nothing to do with alpha-omega biology, and everything to do with 4 months of careful, patient devotion finally catching up to both of us at once. "Cross." My name in his mouth was rough, almost a question. "Can I kiss you?" My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I was certain he could hear it. Every instinct I'd spent years sharpening into a blade. Don't depend, don't need, don't let them close enough to leave a mark when they go, screamed at me to walk away. But underneath all that armor was a quieter voice, one that had been growing louder every single day he'd shown up, rain or shine, with terrible coffee and unwavering patience. "Yes," I whispered. He cupped my jaw like I was something he was afraid of breaking, and when his lips finally met mine, it wasn't the desperate, claiming kiss every story about alphas and omegas had warned me to expect. It was slow, reverent. He kissed me like he had all the time in the world and intended to spend every second of it proving he meant what he'd said weeks ago. "I'm not going anywhere." When we broke apart, both of us breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against mine, and for one terrifying, beautiful moment, the noise in my head, the trauma, the fear, the years of grief, went utterly, blessedly silent. That, he murmured, was worth every rejected coffee. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised me with how easily it escaped. Don't get used to it, Chester. I'm still not your Omega. No, he agreed, eyes warm, thumb stroking once along my cheekbone before he let me go. You're your own. I'm just hoping you'll let me orbit. It wasn't easy after that. Nothing worth having ever is. His family made their disapproval brutally clear within the month, his mother cornering me once at a charity gala I'd only attended because Arturo had asked, looking me up and down like I was something tracked in on the bottom of an expensive shoe. My son could have any Omega in the country, she said, voice pitched low enough not to carry but sharp enough to cut. Old families. Real bloodlines. Instead, he's chasing a construction worker with no name and a tragedy for a backstory. I have a name, I said evenly, refusing to let her see how badly the words landed. It's Cross Klinton, and I didn't ask your son to chase anything. He just refuses to stop. She didn't have a response for that. Arturo, appearing at my side moments later with 2 glasses of champagne and murder in his eyes when he caught the tail end of the exchange, certainly did. Though I made him promise not to make a scene, because I'd survived worse than a disapproving mother-in-law, and I intended to do it with my dignity intact. The board at his company wasn't much kinder, whispering about reputational risk, about an unconventional Omega being unfit for the image of Chester Holdings. Arturo's response was to put my name on 3 new safety initiatives across his properties. Not as a gift, never as a gift, but because I'd earned every line of that contract through merit alone, a fact he made sure every boardroom understood in blunt, unmistakable terms. You didn't have to defend me like that, I told him afterward, equal parts annoyed and absurdly touched. I wasn't defending you, he said, tugging me gently against his chest, lips brushing my temple. I was correcting a factual error. You're the most competent person in any room you walk into. I just made sure they noticed. I buried my face against his shoulder, hiding the way that simple, steady belief in me did something dangerous to the walls I'd spent years building. He smelled like cedar and rain, like safety, like something I hadn't let myself want since the night my old life burned down around me. I'm scared, I admitted quietly, the words costing me more than I expected. Of what? Of becoming what they expect. Soft, dependent, erased into someone's wife instead of staying cross. He pulled back just enough to look at me, dark eyes fierce and certain in the low light. Then don't disappear. I never asked you to. I fell for the Omega who told a billionaire to wait his turn behind a sandwich, cross. I have absolutely no interest in loving anyone less than that. My chest ached with something too big for words, so instead I kissed him, slow, certain, choosing him with my whole steady, unbreakable self, and somewhere in the quiet after, for the first time since the fire took everything from me, I let myself believe that loving someone didn't have to mean losing myself to do it. The city outside kept moving, indifferent and loud, but inside the small orbit we'd built together, something fragile and fierce had finally taken root. It wouldn't be easy from here. His world was sharp-edged and unforgiving, full of people who'd keep testing whether I belonged in it. But for the first time in 4 years, I wasn't facing any of it alone, and somehow, impossibly, that didn't feel like weakness at all. It felt like home. 6 months in, and the city had started calling us something other than scandal. Not officially. Arturo's family still sniffed disapproval at every gala. The tabloids still ran the occasional cruel headline speculating how long the construction Omega would last. But on the ground, where it actually mattered, things had shifted. I'd been promoted twice at my firm. I'd started giving safety compliance seminars across 3 companies, my own name on the slides instead of someone else's. And somewhere along the way, without either of us quite marking the moment, I'd started spending more nights at Arturo's penthouse than my own cramped apartment. Not because I needed to. I made sure of that distinction every single time, usually with my chin tilted up and my voice sharp enough that he never mistook it for surrender. I have my own bed, I told him for what felt like the 100th time, standing in his ridiculous kitchen, marble counters, a view that made my chest ache, more space than any 2 people needed. You do, he agreed easily. Not looking up from the dinner he was somehow cooking himself, sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking entirely too good for a man who ran an empire by day. I'm not stopping you from using it. Then why does half my wardrobe live in your closet now? Convenience, he said, glancing at me with that maddening almost smile. Also, I like waking up to you. Sue me again. I rolled my eyes, but the warmth blooming in my chest betrayed me completely. This was the part nobody warned me about. Not the grand gestures, not the kisses that still stole my breath months later, but the small, domestic devastation of a man who remembered I hated cilantro, who left the hallway light on without being asked because he'd noticed, once, that full darkness still made my pulse spike on bad nights. Eat, he said, sliding a plate toward me. Then tell me about your day, because Reyes called me. Reyes called you? Force of habit. He still thinks I'm checking up on his sites. Arturo's mouth quirked. He mentioned you caught a structural fault at the Lindell building that the original engineer missed entirely. It wasn't a big deal. It would have collapsed within the year, Cross. I shrugged, suddenly very interested in my food, uncomfortable the way I always got when praise landed somewhere too close to my chest. He let it go, the way he always did when he noticed me pulling inward, content instead to reach across the counter and lace his fingers loosely through mine, thumb tracing slow circles against my knuckles while we ate in comfortable quiet. It was good. It was for the first time in longer than I could remember, easy. Which should have told me something was about to go wrong. The first note arrived 2 weeks later, slipped under the door of my old apartment. The one I still technically kept, stubborn proof that I hadn't fully surrendered my independence. No envelope. Just a single line, typed cold. Omegas who forget their place tend to get reminded of it. I told myself it was nothing. Some bitter rival from the firm. Some anonymous coward hiding behind a printer. I didn't tell Arturo. I didn't want to be the Omega who ran to her alpha over a piece of paper. Didn't want to give his family one more reason to whisper that I couldn't handle myself out in the world he occupied. The second note came 4 days later, this time at my actual job site, tucked into my hard hat where no stranger should have had access. He'll tire of you eventually. They always do. Walk away before it gets ugly. My hands shook reading it, old instincts flaring. Not fear of Arturo tiring of me. I'd stopped believing that lie months ago, but fear of the unknown, fear that had lived in me since flames swallowed my whole world and left me standing in the wreckage of it. I shoved the note in my pocket and finished my shift like nothing had happened, because that was what I did. I survived things quietly. I always had. Arturo noticed anyway. Of course he did. You've been distant for days, he said that evening, voice careful, watching me from across the penthouse like he was trying to solve an equation that kept refusing to balance. Talk to me. It's nothing. Cross. It's handled. I snapped, sharper than I meant, and immediately hated the way his expression flickered. Not anger, never anger with me, just a quiet, wounded confusion that made guilt twist hot in my stomach. I exhaled, pulled both notes from my bag where I'd kept them, and set them on the counter between us without another word. He read them in silence. The temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees, the air around him going taut and dangerous in a way I'd never witnessed before. Not from him, not directed at anything real. Who else has seen these? He said, voice gone low and lethally calm. No one. I didn't want. You didn't want me to know someone is threatening you. It wasn't a question. His jaw tightened, dark eyes flashing with something fierce and protective that made my pulse stutter despite the fear still coiled in my chest. Cross, this isn't about whether you can handle yourself. I know exactly how capable you are. I've spent a year watching you prove it to an entire city that doubted you. This is about someone targeting you to get to me, and you hiding it because you're terrified of looking weak. The accuracy of it stung worse than any insult could have. I've spent my whole life refusing to be the Omega who needs protecting, I said, voice cracking despite my best effort to keep it steady. If I tell you, if I let you handle this, what does that make me? He crossed the space between us in 3 strides, cupping my face with both hands, forcing me to meet the raw honesty in his eyes. It makes you human, he said. Strength was never about facing everything alone, Cross. It's about knowing when to let someone stand beside you instead of in front of you. I'm not trying to fight your battles for you. I'm asking you to let me fight with you. Something in me, some old, exhausted piece of armor I'd carried since I was 22 and utterly alone, finally, quietly cracked. Okay, I whispered. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days, forehead dropping to rest against mine. Okay. The notes turned out to trace back to a disgruntled former employee of his, fired months earlier for embezzlement, apparently convinced that destabilizing Arturo's personal life would somehow win back the career he'd lost through his own corruption. The security team Arturo quietly deployed had him in custody within a week, and the moment the threat lifted, something in the air between us shifted again. Relief, yes, but also something rawer, closer, the kind of closeness that comes from surviving fear together instead of apart. That night, the city lights scattered gold across the floor of his bedroom. He kissed me slower than he ever had before, like the fear of almost losing something fragile had stripped away whatever restraint either of us had left. "Stay," he murmured against my mouth. Not a command, never a command from him, a request soft and certain. "Tonight. Just stay." I answered by pulling him closer instead of speaking, my fingers curling into the front of his shirt, every wall I'd built over 4 lonely years finally, willingly coming down. What followed was slow and unhurried, full of quiet murmured reassurances and careful hands that asked permission with every step instead of assuming it. His lips tracing warm, deliberate heat along my throat, my name falling from him like something sacred rather than claimed. There was nothing about the way he touched me that echoed the old fears I'd carried about alphas and ownership. Every press of his mouth, every low murmur against my skin, asked instead of took, gave instead of demanded. The city hummed quietly beyond the glass while the rest of the world simply ceased to exist, narrowed down to warmth and trust and the steady, devoted way he worshipped every inch of me like he'd been waiting his whole life for exactly this. Afterward, tangled together beneath the sheets, his heartbeat steady beneath my ear, the silence between us felt like the safest place I'd ever existed. I used to think needing someone meant losing myself, I admitted quietly, fingers tracing idle patterns over his chest. I don't think that anymore. He pressed a kiss to the crown of my head, arms tightening around me. You haven't lost a single piece of yourself, Cross. You've just finally let someone help you carry it. Outside, the city kept its restless rhythm, indifferent to the two of us wrapped in something quiet and unbreakable. But inside that room, for the first time since the fire took everything I thought I knew about safety, I finally understood that love, the right kind, the patient, steady kind, didn't ask you to be smaller. It just asked you to stop carrying everything alone. The embezzler's arrest made small headlines, easily buried beneath bigger news cycles, but the quiet fallout lingered in ways I hadn't expected. Arturo became more careful, never suffocating, never overbearing, but present in small, deliberate ways. A car waiting outside my old apartment on nights I worked late. A security detail he never mentioned outright, but I noticed anyway. The same 2 faces showing up at a respectful distance whenever I left a site alone. "I can take care of myself," I told him one evening, only half irritated, mostly amused at how transparent he was trying not to be. "I know," he said, not even bothering to deny it. "Doesn't mean I'm going to stop making sure you don't have to do it without backup." I let that one go. Some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the man fighting for my safety asked nothing from me in return except permission to care. It was 3 months later, at a charity gala neither of us could avoid, that his mother finally cornered me again, except this time, something had shifted. "Mr. Klinton," she said, the honorific clipped but no longer dripping with the same venom from our first encounter. A word. Arturo straightened beside me, every line of him bracing for confrontation, but I touched his arm lightly. "It's fine," I murmured, and stepped aside with her toward the quieter end of the terrace. She studied me for a long moment, champagne untouched in her hand, the city skyline glittering gold behind her. "My husband died when Arturo was 19, she said finally, unprompted, voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. He became responsible for an empire before he'd finished growing into a man. I watched dozens of Omegas circle him over the years, drawn to the company, the name, the power. I assumed you were simply better at hiding it than the rest. I understand why you'd think that. I don't think that anymore." She turned to look at me directly, something almost vulnerable cracking through her composure. "I watched you walk away from the head of a multinational corporation the first week you met him, over a sandwich. According to the story, everyone insists on retelling at every dinner party in this city. I watched you build a career with your own 2 hands instead of his money. And 3 weeks ago, when that situation with the threatening notes happened, my son told me you nearly didn't tell him at all because you were more afraid of looking weak than you were of being in danger." She paused. "That is not the profile of someone chasing a fortune, Mr. Klinton. That is the profile of someone terrified of losing themselves." My throat tightened unexpectedly. "I am terrified of that," I admitted quietly. I've spent my whole life refusing to be defined by my designation. It's hard to let that go, even for him. Then don't let it go. Her voice softened further, something like respect settling into the lines of her face. Don't disappear into being his omega cross. Stay exactly as insufferably stubborn as you are now. It's clearly the only thing keeping my son human instead of the cold machine the board prefers him to be. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was close enough that something tight in my chest finally eased. When Arturo found me 10 minutes later, scanning the terrace with poorly disguised worry, I just smiled and slipped my hand into his. Your mother, I said, might actually like me now. He blinked, genuinely stunned for the second time since I'd known him. What did you do? Existed stubbornly. Apparently it's effective. The next conflict didn't come from his world. It came from mine. A new safety director had been hired at a rival firm. An alpha named Desmond Voss, smug and entitled in the particular way of men who'd never once had to earn anything they possessed. He'd taken a liking to challenging my expertise in meetings, undercutting my reports in front of clients, the kind of casual cruelty dressed up as professional disagreement that I recognized instantly for what it was. An alpha who couldn't stand an omega outranking him in competence. It came to a head during a joint inspection on one of Arturo's buildings, when Voss dismissed a structural concern I'd flagged in front of an entire room of executives. With respect, he said, in a tone that held none, perhaps this requires someone with more field experience to verify. No offense, Klinton, but omegas aren't typically known for catching these kinds of details. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms do right before something detonates. The detail in question, I said evenly, sliding the structural report across the table toward him, is a hairline stress fracture in the support beam on level 12, consistent with the same fault that collapsed the Hendricks building 18 months ago and killed 3 workers. I've attached the engineering citations. Feel free to verify it with more field experience if you'd like, though I'd suggest doing so before someone else gets hurt because you didn't want to take an omega's word for it. Voss's face went red, several executives around the table fighting smiles, and Arturo, seated at the head of the table, arms crossed, watching the whole exchange with an expression of barely restrained pride, said nothing at all, letting me handle it exactly the way I'd insisted on handling everything since the day we met. It was only after the meeting, once the room had cleared, that he allowed himself to react, pulling me into the empty hallway with a low laugh. I had to physically restrain myself from saying something, he admitted, eyes bright with amusement and something fiercer underneath. You didn't need me to. I never do, I said, though the words came without their old sharp edge, softened by months of learning that needing wasn't the same as losing. No, he agreed, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, voice dropping low. But I like being here to watch anyway. Voss was quietly let go within the month. Not because of Arturo's influence, which he pointedly never used, but because the structural fault I'd flagged turned out to be exactly as severe as I'd warned, and Voss's dismissal of it on record became a liability no firm wanted attached to their name. I felt no triumph in it, only the same steady satisfaction I always felt when my work protected people who'd never know my name. That evening, Arturo found me on the penthouse balcony, city lights spread out beneath us like scattered stars fallen to earth. You've spent the whole night somewhere else, he said, settling beside me, close but not crowding, the way he always was. Just thinking. About Voss. About all of it. I exhaled slowly, watching the traffic crawl gold and red far below. A year ago, I would have sworn this life wasn't possible. Not the success. I always believed I'd earn that eventually. But this, I gestured vaguely between us. This kind of love. I didn't think it existed without cost. Without losing some piece of myself to keep it. He turned to face me fully, expression unguarded in a way he rarely allowed anyone to see, even me. Has it cost you anything? Tell me honestly. I considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. My fear, I said finally. It's cost me my fear, mostly. The trauma still surfaces sometimes. A sound, a smell, a stupid backfiring truck. But it doesn't own me the way it used to. You didn't fix me, Arturo. I want to be clear about that. But you gave me somewhere safe to fall apart, and somewhere safe to put myself back together. That's not nothing. His eyes were suspiciously bright in the city light, throat working around words that seemed too large to fit easily past it. Cross Klinton, he said finally, voice rough. I have built an empire from nothing. I have negotiated deals that made grown men weep across boardroom tables. And nothing, has ever terrified and steadied me the way loving you does. He reached into his jacket pocket then, and my heart stopped entirely at the small velvet box he produced, simple and unassuming, nothing like the gaudy excess I might have expected from a man of his wealth. "I'm not asking you to become anyone's wife," he said quickly, like he'd rehearsed this exact reassurance 100 times. "I'm not asking you to stop being exactly who you are. I'm asking if you'll let me stand beside the most stubborn, brilliant, devastatingly capable Omega in this city for the rest of my life. As your equal, not your owner." Tears I refused to fully release blurred the gold lights below into something soft and shapeless. "You already do stand beside me," I whispered. "But yes, God, yes, Arturo." The kiss that followed tasted like salt and relief, and 4 years of armor finally, completely, dissolving into something far stronger than the walls I'd built alone. Below us, the city kept its restless, indifferent rhythm, utterly unaware that somewhere above its glittering chaos, an Omega who'd sworn never to depend on anyone had just discovered that real strength had never been about standing alone at all. It had always been about choosing freely and fiercely exactly who was worth standing beside. The bonding ceremony wasn't anything like the elaborate spectacle the tabloids speculated about for weeks beforehand. I made that clear from the start. No press, I told Arturo, arms crossed, standing my ground in his office the way I had every important conversation since the day we met. No society pages deciding what this is supposed to look like. If we're doing this, it's ours. Small. Honest. He'd smiled, that rare, unguarded smile he saved only for me now, and simply said, "Whatever you want, Cross." It was never going to be anyone else's day but yours. So on a quiet evening in late autumn, we stood on a stretch of private shoreline 2 hours outside the city, away from boardrooms and bylines, with maybe 30 people who actually mattered. Reyes was there, looking deeply uncomfortable in a suit, but grinning the entire ceremony. Several of my old co-workers from that very first sight, the ones who used to whisper about the Omega on the scaffolding, now raising glasses in my honor instead. Arturo's mother sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she'd deny needing if anyone asked, looking at me with something that had finally, fully, become warmth instead of suspicion. "You look terrified," Arturo murmured as I joined him beneath the simple arch of white flowers, the ocean breathing steady and dark behind us. "I am," I admitted. "Good terrified, though. The kind I used to think I'd never let myself feel again." His hand found mine, thumb brushing reassuringly over my knuckles. "We don't have to do the traditional bonding bite, you know. Not if you're not ready. I told you a year ago, I'm not interested in marking territory. I'm interested in you." I shook my head, throat tight. "I want it. Not because I'm yours to claim, Arturo. Because I'm choosing you. There's a difference, and I need you to understand I know exactly which one this is." "I know," he said softly. "I've always known the difference with you." The ceremony itself was simple. Vows we'd written ourselves, clumsy and honest, mine cracking halfway through when I tried to describe what it felt like to stop being afraid of needing someone, his unraveling entirely when he admitted that loving me had taught him more about strength than building an empire ever had. When the moment came, his lips brushed warm against the curve of my neck, the old instinctive fear flickering once before settling into something entirely different. Not submission, not loss, just the quiet, fierce certainty of being chosen by someone who'd spent a year proving he meant every word. The bond settled into place like something that had always belonged there, warm and steady, neither cage nor leash, just an anchor, freely given, freely accepted. A year after that, I stood on the same scaffolding where this whole improbable story began, except now the hard-hat red director of safety operations beneath my name, and the company logo stitched above my heart was one I'd built half of myself, in partnership with a man who still, after everything, looked at me every morning like he couldn't quite believe his luck. "You're staring," I told him, catching him watching me from the yard below the way he had that very first day. "Force of habit," he called back, echoing words I'd once thrown at him, and even from 40 feet up, I could hear the smile in his voice. I climbed down when my shift ended, found him waiting by his car exactly the way he had 100 times before, except now there was no uncertainty between us, no walls left standing. Just two people who'd built something neither tragedy, nor expectation, nor the weight of an entire skeptical city had managed to break. "Reyes wants to know if we're still doing dinner Friday," he said, opening the door for me, not because I needed it opened, but because he liked doing it, and I'd long since stopped pretending I minded. Tell him yes. And tell him if he calls you again instead of texting me directly, I'm reassigning him to the night shift. Arturo laughed, the sound easy and warm, sliding into the driver's seat beside me. I love you, he said, apropos of nothing, the way he still did sometimes, like the thought simply demanded saying out loud the moment it occurred to him. I used to think those words were dangerous, an admission of weakness, a door left open for loss. I knew better now. I reached over, laced my fingers through his on the center console, and let myself simply exist in the quiet certainty of being loved by someone who'd never once asked me to be smaller for it. I love you too, I said. Now drive. I'm starving, and you promised me dumplings, not declarations. He grinned, pulling out of the lot toward the city skyline glittering gold against the dusk. The same skyline I'd once helped build with my own 2 hands, brick by stubborn brick, long before I ever believed someone like him could love someone like me without asking me to disappear to do it. The fire that took my parents had once convinced me that everything good eventually burns to ash, that the only safety left in the world was the kind you built entirely alone. Arturo Chester had spent a year quietly, patiently proving otherwise, not by carrying me, never that, but by simply, steadily standing beside me while I carried myself, refusing to let go even when I gave him every reason to. I wasn't the Omega the world expected me to become. I never would be. But somewhere between the scaffolding and the boardrooms, between the trauma and the healing, between rejecting an alpha's offer and choosing him freely, fiercely, on my own terms, I'd found something better than the safety I'd spent 4 years building alone. I'd found a home that didn't ask me to be anyone other than exactly who I'd fought so hard to become. And for the first time since the night everything burned, that was enough to finally let the fear go quiet for good.